I didn't walk into that mansion as a bride. I walked in as a mistake someone else refused to fix. I still remember the exact moment the car door opened in front of Blackwell Estate, the cold Chicago air pressing against my skin like a warning I should have understood sooner. My name is Olivia Carter, and I was never supposed to be the one standing there. It was my stepsister Emma who was chosen, Emma who was prepared, Emma who knew how to smile in rooms built on power and silence. But when she disappeared 3 days before the wedding, my family didn't cancel anything. They simply looked at me like I was interchangeable. I told myself I was just filling in, just surviving one night, just preventing a disaster from swallowing my family whole. That was the lie I carried up those stone steps. The mansion didn't feel like a home when I entered. It felt like a decision already made without me. Inside, everything was too perfect to be safe. Crystal lights reflected off marble floors, and every footstep I took sounded like it belonged to someone else. Then I saw him. Ethan Blackwell. He didn't move like a man waiting for a bride. He moved like a man confirming a contract. Black suit, no smile, eyes that didn't ask questions because they already knew the answers. Around him, people lowered their voices without realizing it. Even the air felt different near him, heavier, controlled. My pulse told me to step back, but there was nowhere back to go. When his gaze landed on me, it wasn't curiosity. It was recognition of a problem. "You're not Emma," he said flatly, not loud, not angry, just certain. I swallowed, forcing my voice to work. I know. That was all I could say, because anything more would have been a confession I couldn't afford. The room didn't react. No gasps, no chaos, just quiet adjustment, like the world had already decided to accept whatever Ethan Blackwell decided next. He walked closer, slow enough that I had time to understand I wasn't being approached. I was being evaluated. "Then why are you here?" he asked. The question wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was procedural. I told him the truth I had rehearsed in panic for 3 days, because they sent me. Instead, something flickered in his expression, gone before I could name it. He turned slightly, signaling without words that the ceremony would continue. And just like that, I became his bride on paper, a substitution sealed by silence and signatures. But when the guests stopped watching and the doors finally closed behind the last of them, I realized something worse than being unwanted. I realized he hadn't sent me away. He had let me stay. And men like Ethan Blackwell don't keep mistakes unless they intend to understand why they were made. The moment the doors closed behind the last guest, the silence inside the Blackwell estate felt heavier than any words that had been spoken earlier. I stood in the center of the marble hall, unsure whether I was expected to move, to speak, or to simply disappear into the space like I had never been invited at all. Ethan Blackwell did not look at me immediately. Instead, he adjusted a glass of water on a nearby table with calm precision, as if my presence had already been accounted for in every detail of this house. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same controlled certainty as before, low and steady, without emotion that I could recognize. "There are rules here," he said, not as a warning, but as a fact. I nodded slightly, unsure what response would not be wrong. I had entered this place expecting rejection, but what unsettled me more was being acknowledged at all. A staff member appeared silently at the edge of the hall, offering to show me to the guest wing. I followed without argument, my footsteps soft against the polished floor, aware that every corridor I passed seemed designed to remind me of distance rather than comfort. The guest room was too large, too quiet, and too carefully arranged to feel temporary. Everything inside it looked untouched, like it had been prepared long before I arrived. I stood near the window for a long moment, looking out over the dark Chicago skyline, trying to convince myself that I was still in control of my own decisions. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. When I turned, it was not staff this time, but Ethan. He did not enter fully at first, only standing in the doorway as if the room itself required permission. "You will stay here," he said. Not a question. I hesitated before answering. "For how long?" The silence that followed was not hesitation. It was calculation. "Until I decide what you are," he replied. My breath caught slightly, but I forced myself to hold his gaze. There was no anger in him, no softness either. Only observation, as if I were a variable he had not yet solved. I wanted to ask about Emma, about the arrangement that had been broken and replaced so easily, but something in his expression told me that questions were not a currency I could afford yet. Instead, I asked something smaller. And if I want to leave? His eyes shifted slightly, just enough to acknowledge the question existed. Then you will leave, he said, as if it were possible, as if it were not already decided whether I would ever choose to. Then he turned to leave, pausing only once before stepping fully into the hallway. Do not wander at night, he added without looking back. And then he was gone. I remained by the window long after his footsteps disappeared, trying to understand why a man who had called me a mistake had not corrected it, why I was still here when I should have been dismissed, and why the silence of this house now felt less like rejection and more like waiting. The night did not end so much as it dissolved into a quiet that felt intentional, as if the house itself had decided sleep was something that happened elsewhere, not here. I did not remember when I finally sat down on the edge of the bed in the guest room, only that the silence outside my door carried a strange weight, like the entire estate was listening even when nothing was being said. Morning arrived without warmth. Light filtered through heavy curtains in a controlled, filtered way that made it impossible to tell what time it truly was without checking a clock. When I finally stepped out into the hallway, the house was already awake in a way that felt structured rather than lived in. Staff moved quietly, efficiently, avoiding unnecessary sound. I followed the scent of coffee down a long corridor until I reached a dining space I had not seen before, a room that looked less like a place for meals and more like a place where decisions were made. Ethan was already there. He was seated at the head of the table, reading something on a thin tablet, his posture calm in a way that suggested he had been awake long before the rest of the house. He did not look up immediately when I entered, and for a moment I wondered if my presence still required acknowledgement or if I had already been categorized into something routine. A chair had been placed on the opposite side of the table. Not close, not far, just deliberately positioned. I sat down slowly, unsure whether silence was expected or simply enforced. A plate was placed in front of me a moment later, simple food, arranged with precision that made it feel less like hospitality and more like structure. Ethan finally looked up. His gaze settled on me with the same measured attention as before, but now there was something additional underneath it, something like quiet assessment. You adjusted to the house without incident, he said, as if this was a report rather than an observation. I hesitated before responding. I did not know there was anything to adjust to. That earned the faintest pause from him, not amusement, not irritation, just a brief interruption in calculation. He set the tablet down. Most people try to leave within the first night, he said. I looked down at the table for a moment before answering honestly. I was not most people yesterday. He studied me longer than I was comfortable with, not in a way that felt personal, but in a way that made me aware of how easily I could be measured without my permission. A staff member entered quietly and placed a folder beside his plate. He opened it briefly, scanning its contents without changing expression. I caught a glimpse of names, numbers, references I did not understand. Then it was closed again as if it had never been there. You will not attend public functions, he said suddenly, returning his attention to me. I blinked slightly. Am I allowed to leave the house at all? He leaned back slightly, as if considering the boundaries of a question that had not been formally addressed before. Within reason, he said. That word carried more weight than it should have. Before I could respond, he added, you will be accompanied. I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear exactly, but awareness that independence here was not something taken, but something granted. A moment of silence passed before I asked the question I had been avoiding since last night. And Emma? His expression did not change, but something in the air did. He did not answer immediately, and in that delay I understood that her absence was not simple. Finally, he spoke. That arrangement ended before you arrived. No explanation followed. None was offered. I should have felt relieved, or confused, or even angry, but instead I only felt the strange realization that I had stepped into a situation that had already been moving long before I became part of it. Ethan stood then, signaling the end of the conversation as easily as he had begun it. You will learn the structure here, he said, adjusting his cuff without looking at me. And if I do not? I asked. He paused at the edge of the room, just long enough for the question to settle. Then you will understand why it exists, he replied before leaving, and I remained seated at the table, staring at untouched food, realizing that nothing in this house was random, including me. I began to understand that life inside the Blackwell estate was not measured in hours, but in permissions. Every door that opened seemed to open only because someone decided I was allowed to pass through it, not because I had chosen to walk. By the third day, I had memorized the rhythm of the house, the way staff appeared and disappeared without sound, the way conversations stopped when Ethan Blackwell entered a room, and the way even silence seemed to adjust itself around him. That morning, I was told I would be taken outside. Not alone, not freely. The words were not spoken as restriction, but as instruction. A black vehicle waited at the front entrance, engine already running, polished enough to reflect the gray sky above Chicago. I stepped inside, and the door closed with a soft finality that made me realize there was no difference between being inside the estate and being outside of it. Ethan sat across from me in the back seat. He did not look at me immediately, instead reviewing something on a folded document resting on his knee. The city moved past the tinted windows, buildings rising and falling like distant thoughts. After several minutes, he spoke without lifting his eyes. "You will be observed less in public, but never unaccompanied," he said. I looked out the window before responding. "Is that for my safety or yours?" The question lingered longer than I expected. When I turned back, his gaze was already on me. "There is no difference," he said simply. We arrived at a private office building on the edge of downtown, quieter than the estate, but somehow more controlled. Inside, everything felt too clean, too precise, like every surface had been designed to erase uncertainty. I was led into a glass-walled conference room where a woman in her 40s waited. She introduced herself as Claire, though she did not offer a last name. Her attention moved between me and Ethan with the kind of efficiency that suggested she already understood the structure of our situation better than I did. Ethan took a seat without ceremony, gesturing for me to do the same. Claire opened a file and began speaking about schedules, appearances, and expectations that sounded less like a marriage and more like a managed arrangement between entities that required alignment. I listened, but what unsettled me was not what was being said, but how naturally it was being accepted. At one point, Claire paused and glanced at me directly. "There is still the matter of public perception," she said carefully. Ethan responded before I could. "It will be managed." No further explanation followed. After the meeting ended, I found myself standing alone near a wide window overlooking the city. Ethan remained behind, speaking quietly with Claire, his voice low enough that it blended into the room's controlled atmosphere. I watched the traffic below, thinking about how easily entire lives moved forward without ever asking permission from the people living them. When he finally joined me, he did not stand too close, but close enough that I was aware of his presence without looking at him. "You are not trapped here," he said suddenly, as if responding to a thought I had not spoken. I turned slightly. "It does not feel that way." He did not deny it. Instead, he said, "Feelings are not always accurate indicators of structure." That should have ended the conversation, but it did not. As we left the building, I noticed a car waiting across the street, dark and still, its presence subtle but deliberate. Ethan noticed it too. His expression did not change, but his attention shifted for a fraction of a second, enough for me to understand that even silence in this world had an audience. I realized that in Ethan Blackwell's world, even a glance could be measured like a transaction, and that thought stayed with me longer than the car ride back to the estate. The vehicle moved through Chicago streets in silence, so controlled it felt intentional, as if even the engine noise had been negotiated before departure. Ethan did not speak after noticing the presence across the street earlier, and I learned quickly that his silence was never empty. It was active, like he was listening to something no one else could hear. When we returned to the estate, the front doors opened before we reached them, as if our arrival had already been announced in advance. I stepped inside, expecting the familiar stillness, but instead sensed a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as though the house itself had adjusted to something unseen. Ethan walked ahead of me without turning back, his pace steady, his presence enough to signal that I was expected to follow, but not to question. I did, because at that point, questioning felt less like defiance and more like stepping outside a boundary I had not yet understood. In the main corridor, I noticed new faces among the staff, people I had not seen before, positioned at intervals that made no sense until I realized they were not there to serve, but to observe. Ethan stopped near a side room and finally spoke. "You will remain inside the estate for the next few days," he said, as if stating weather conditions rather than restricting movement. I hesitated before responding. "Is that related to what you saw outside the building?" For the first time since I had known him, his expression shifted slightly, not enough to reveal emotion, but enough to confirm awareness. "It is related to everything," he said. That answer should have frightened me more than it did, but instead it clarified something I had been sensing since the first night. Nothing around him existed without reason. Later that evening, I found myself in the library, a room I had not been shown before, but somehow already felt expected to enter. The space was lined with shelves that stretched too high to feel inviting, filled with books that looked untouched but intentionally placed. I was not alone for long. Ethan entered without announcement, carrying nothing, his attention already focused on me as if he had been tracking my presence before stepping inside. He stopped a few feet away, not close enough to invade space, but close enough that distance felt calculated. "You are adjusting faster than expected," he said. I closed the book I had picked up without reading. "Is that a problem?" He did not answer immediately, and in that pause I noticed something unusual, not in his posture, but in the way he seemed to evaluate silence itself before continuing. "Most people resist structure," he finally said. I looked at him directly. Maybe I am not most people. That earned a brief pause, shorter than before, but noticeable enough that I registered it as deviation. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and in that space I became aware of how carefully every interaction in this house was designed to avoid unpredictability, except for me. Ethan eventually moved toward the window, his attention shifting outward to the estate grounds below. "There are systems in place to ensure stability here," he said, almost as if continuing an internal thought aloud. I followed his gaze. "And where do I fit in that system?" He did not turn around when he answered. "That is what is still being determined." The words should have made me feel like an object under review, but instead they created something more unsettling, the sense that I was not simply being evaluated, but integrated into something already in motion. As night settled over the estate again, I returned to my room, but sleep did not come easily. Outside my door, I thought I heard footsteps once, then nothing, then the faintest sound of movement that might have been nothing at all. And for the first time since arriving, I understood that the real boundaries of this place were not the walls I could see, but the decisions being made about me while I was still inside it. I stopped counting the hours I had spent inside the Blackwell estate because time here did not behave like it did anywhere else. It stretched, folded, and disappeared in ways that made every day feel like part of a single continuous moment. By the time the 6th morning arrived, I no longer waited to be told where to go inside the house, because I had learned that movement itself was allowed only when the space permitted it. That morning, I was asked to come to a different section of the estate, a quieter wing I had not been to before. The hallway leading there felt older, less polished, as if it belonged to a different version of the same world. Ethan was already there when I arrived. He stood near a long table, reviewing documents scattered in a precise arrangement. He did not look up immediately, but I could feel that he was aware of my presence the moment I entered. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, without introduction or greeting. "You will accompany me today," he said. I paused slightly before responding. "Where?" He set the paper down, finally meeting my eyes. "Somewhere you have not been." There was no additional explanation, and I realized that asking for one would not change anything. The drive this time was longer, moving out of the city and into quieter suburban roads where the buildings grew further apart and the landscape opened into wide stretches of controlled greenery. Ethan remained silent for most of the journey, his attention occasionally shifting to his phone, though he never appeared distracted. I watched the passing scenery, noticing how the further we moved from the city, the more I became aware of how little I actually knew about the boundaries of his world. Eventually, we arrived at a private facility that did not resemble a home or an office. It was structured, quiet, and carefully maintained, with security present but not intrusive. Ethan led the way inside without hesitation, and I followed, noticing how every person we passed acknowledged him without speaking. We entered a consultation room where a young boy sat quietly near a window, drawing with slow, careful movements. A woman stood nearby, introducing herself as part of the support staff. She explained that the child had difficulty speaking after a recent traumatic event and required a controlled environment for communication therapy. I listened, but what struck me more than the explanation was the silence of the boy, not empty silence, but focused silence, as if he had chosen it. Ethan did not speak immediately. Instead, he observed the room with the same controlled attention he gave everything else. After a moment, he said, "We have tried multiple specialists." The woman nodded. "He responds better to consistency than instruction." I did not realize I had moved closer until I was standing a few feet away from the boy. He did not look at me at first, but when I lowered myself to his level, his pencil paused. I did not speak right away. Instead, I sat quietly, matching his stillness, allowing the silence to exist without demanding anything from it. After several minutes, he pushed a sheet of paper slightly toward me. There were simple shapes on it, uneven but intentional. I added a small mark beside one of them, not changing anything, just continuing it. He watched, then slowly returned to drawing. I did not notice Ethan approaching until he was standing nearby, observing without interruption. There was no instruction from him, no correction, only watchful presence. The staff member seemed surprised by how long the boy remained engaged, but said nothing. When we finally left the room, Ethan did not comment immediately. We walked through the corridor toward the exit in silence. Outside, the air felt different, less controlled, but still heavy with the awareness of observation. As we reached the vehicle, he finally spoke. "You did not try to fix him," he said. I looked at him. Was I supposed to? He opened the door, but did not enter yet. "Most people do," he replied. Then, after a pause that felt more deliberate than before, he added, "He stayed longer than usual." I did not know why that detail mattered, but I could sense that it did. As we drove back toward the estate, I realized something unsettling. Every place he brought me to, every situation I was placed inside, felt less like exposure and more like evaluation. And for the first time, I began to suspect that I was not only being watched for what I did, but for what I might become when no one told me how to behave. I began to notice that the longer I stayed inside Ethan Blackwell's world, the more the boundaries between observation and participation started to blur, as if I was no longer just moving through his environment, but slowly becoming part of its design. Days passed in a rhythm that felt increasingly intentional, each morning bringing a new request, each evening ending with the same controlled silence that seemed to follow me even when no one was speaking. On the seventh day, I was told to remain in the estate, but not inside the usual rooms I had become familiar with. Instead, a staff member guided me to a section I had not been allowed to enter before, a quieter wing where conversations felt unnecessary and even footsteps seemed to carry more weight than usual. Ethan was already there when I arrived. He stood near a large window overlooking the estate grounds, his posture unchanged from every other time I had seen him, composed, still, and aware of everything without needing to visibly acknowledge it. When he finally turned, his eyes met mine briefly before shifting back toward the space behind me, as if confirming something that had already been anticipated. "There will be visitors today," he said. I hesitated slightly before responding. Visitors for what purpose? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked past me toward the center of the room, placing a single folder on a long table. "Assessment," he said simply. The word carried more weight than it should have, not because of its meaning, but because of the way he used it, as if it applied to everything within his reach, including me. I remained silent as he continued speaking. "You will observe, and you will remain present without interruption." I nodded, though I was not entirely sure what I was agreeing to. Later that afternoon, several individuals arrived at the estate. They were not introduced in detail, only acknowledged as part of a scheduled meeting. The atmosphere shifted subtly when they entered, not in an obvious way, but enough that I noticed how the staff adjusted their movements and how conversations shortened into efficiency. I was positioned in a nearby room where I could see through a partially open partition, close enough to observe but not included in the discussion itself. Ethan entered the main room last. When he did, the tone of the space changed immediately. He did not raise his voice, did not need to, but every person present adjusted their attention toward him without hesitation. The meeting began without formal opening. Names were exchanged, numbers were referenced, and decisions were discussed in a language that felt structured rather than emotional. I listened without understanding the full context, but I noticed something else instead. Every time Ethan spoke, there was no negotiation in his tone, only alignment or correction. At one point, one of the visitors glanced toward my direction, briefly, before looking away. Ethan noticed the glance. He did not react outwardly, but I saw the smallest pause in his attention before continuing the discussion as if nothing had occurred. After the meeting concluded, the visitors left in the same quiet manner they had arrived, leaving behind a silence that felt more deliberate than before. I was asked to remain where I was until Ethan returned. When he finally entered the room, it was without urgency, but with the same controlled presence that made every space feel smaller when he was inside it. He stopped a few feet away from me, studying my expression without speaking at first. "You observed everything," he said. I nodded slightly. I did not understand everything. He did not respond immediately, and in that pause I noticed something I had not seen before, not softness, not emotion, but consideration. "Understanding comes after exposure," he said finally. I looked at him more directly than I had before. "And what am I being exposed to exactly?" For a moment, he did not answer. His gaze shifted briefly toward the direction the visitors had left, then returned to me. "Structure," he said simply. That answer should have clarified nothing, but instead it made something in my thoughts tighten, because I began to realize that every place I had been taken, every situation I had been placed inside, was not random. It was sequential, designed. As we stood there in the quiet room after everyone had gone, I became aware of something I could not ignore any longer. I was not being kept here by force, nor was I being entirely excluded from what was happening around me. I was being gradually introduced to it, one step at a time, as if someone was waiting to see whether I would resist the structure or eventually learn to move within it without being told. I did not realize I had started waiting for Ethan Blackwell's presence until I noticed how the silence of the estate felt different when he was not near it. It was no longer just quiet. It felt incomplete, as if something essential to its structure had been temporarily removed. That thought unsettled me more than I wanted to admit, because it meant I was no longer measuring the house by its walls or its rules, but by him. That evening, I was called to the central hall again, though no explanation was given. When I arrived, the space was already prepared in a way that suggested anticipation rather than routine. Ethan stood near the center, not speaking immediately, his attention focused on something I could not yet see. When I stepped closer, I noticed documents laid out on a long table, but this time they were not simply reports or schedules. There were names, structured paths, references to locations I did not recognize, and timelines that extended beyond anything I had been included in before. I did not touch anything. I only observed. Ethan finally spoke without turning toward me. "You have reached the point where observation is no longer enough," he said. I hesitated before responding. "What does that mean?" He turned slightly, his expression unchanged but more deliberate than before. "It means you are no longer outside the structure," he replied. The words should have felt like confirmation of what I had already suspected, but instead they felt like a transition I had not agreed to consciously. I looked at the documents again, noticing how carefully everything was organized, not like information waiting to be reviewed, but like something already in motion. "Why am I being shown this?" I asked. There was a pause before he answered, and in that pause I noticed something different, not hesitation, but precision, as if the answer had to be selected rather than spoken. "Because you remain," he said simply. I did not immediately understand what he meant by that, and he seemed to recognize it without needing clarification. He walked closer to the table, placing his hand near the edge of one of the documents without touching it. "Most people who enter this environment either leave or become irrelevant to it," he continued. "You have done neither." I felt a tightening in my chest that was not fear, but awareness of implication. "And what happens to people who do not leave or become irrelevant?" I asked. He looked at me directly for a moment longer than usual. "They integrate," he said. The word stayed in the air longer than any explanation could have. I did not respond immediately because I realized I did not fully understand whether integration meant acceptance or absorption, participation or surrender. Ethan stepped back slightly, returning to his usual distance, as if the conversation had reached its intended point. "You are not being forced," he added, almost as an afterthought. "You are being measured." That sentence changed nothing and everything at once. because it confirmed what I had felt since the beginning, that every interaction, every silence, every controlled moment inside this estate had been part of something larger than hospitality or arrangement. As I stood there, I became aware of a subtle shift in how I saw the room itself. It was no longer just a space I was inside, but a system I was moving through, one that responded to my presence in ways I had not yet fully understood. Ethan began to leave the room, but paused briefly at the threshold. "You will decide your position soon," he said without looking back. And for the first time since entering this world, I understood that the decision he was referring to might not be about whether I stayed or left, but about whether I remained someone passing through his structure or became part of the logic that sustained it. I understood that nothing in Ethan Blackwell's world ever truly ended. It only changed form until it fit the structure he had already designed. And that realization came to me slowly as I stood alone in the central hall after he had left the room, surrounded by silence that no longer felt empty but intentional. The documents he had shown me earlier were still in my mind, not as images but as patterns, as if my thoughts were being trained to recognize order where I had once seen confusion. I began to notice how every conversation I had experienced since arriving, every corridor I had walked, every instruction I had been given, all seemed to point toward the same unseen conclusion, that I was not an outsider being tolerated, but a variable being placed. Later that night, I was asked to return to the same room without explanation, and when I entered, Ethan was already there again, standing near the window, as if he had never left. He did not turn immediately, but I could feel that he was aware of my arrival in the same way he was aware of everything else in his environment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same controlled certainty I had come to recognize, but there was something different beneath it, something closer to finality. "You have reached the final stage of observation," he said. I stood still for a moment, processing the meaning of the words before responding. "And what happens now?" He turned toward me fully for the first time that evening, his expression unchanged but more focused than before. "Now there is only placement," he said. The word did not feel like a threat or a promise, but like an outcome already decided by everything that had come before it. I looked at him more carefully than I had ever allowed myself to before, noticing not just his presence, but the absence of hesitation in it, as if doubt had never been part of his language. "Placement into what?" I asked. He did not answer immediately, and in that silence I felt something shift, not in the room, but in the way I understood the room itself, as if I was finally seeing the framework rather than just moving inside it. Ethan walked a few steps closer, stopping at a distance that was neither intimate nor distant, but exact. "Into position," he said. I exhaled slowly, realizing that every question I had asked since arriving had not been about escape or understanding, but about defining where I stood in relation to him. "And if I do not accept that position?" I asked quietly. For the first time, his gaze did not move away immediately. He studied me with a stillness that felt more honest than anything he had said so far. "Then you will remain outside it," he replied. That answer should have given me relief, but instead it created something more complicated, because I realized that remaining outside was no longer something I could imagine clearly. The estate, the city, the people I had met, even my own thoughts, had slowly been reshaped by repetition and proximity until the idea of outside felt less like freedom and more like absence. Ethan turned slightly, looking out toward the window again, his voice quieter now. "Most people resist structure because they mistake it for control," he said. "But structure is what allows things to continue without breaking." I listened without interrupting, because I no longer felt like the conversation was about agreement or disagreement, but about recognition. When he finally looked back at me, there was no pressure in his expression, only certainty that the process he had spoken of was already underway. "You were never randomly placed here," he said. "You were placed where you could be observed correctly." I did not respond immediately, because I understood that the question was no longer whether I belonged or not, but whether I had already adapted without realizing it. In that moment, standing inside a system I had once believed I had entered by accident, I realized that the most unsettling truth was not that Ethan Blackwell controlled everything around me, but that I had stopped resisting the possibility that I might be exactly where I was meant to remain.